Hello, everyone. Welcome to this event today, Online Choice Architecture, How Digital Design Can Harm Competition and Consumers, hosted here at the Competition and Markets Authority and also online. Welcome. So this follows the CMA's publication about 6 weeks ago of 2 papers on the same topic. And we're following up so that we can have a much broader discussion and begin to discuss more with you all. So my name's Stefan Hunt, and I'm the Chief Data and Technology Insight Officer at the Competition and Markets Authority. And I run a whole bunch of data and technology teams, but I also have, as part of the unit, is a behavioural team as well. So I am a card-carrying economist, but also in another life, I was a psychologist. My first degree is actually in psychology, and I think we'll find that the psychology is incredibly important for understanding what's happening in markets. So that's really the topic today. So we've got a great agenda for the next couple of hours. To begin, I'm going to spend about 10 minutes explaining what's in the 2 papers that we published. We're then going to hand over to Cass Sunstein, and I'll introduce Cass properly in a few minutes. And then we've got 2 panels. The first panel, can we have the slides changing? Thank you. The first panel is on why does online choice architecture matter for consumers and businesses. That's going to be hosted by my colleague George Lusty, who's the Senior Director for Competition Enforcement at the CMA. And he's going to introduce the panelists in full when he begins the panel. It's got Lucia Reisch, Eric Johnson, and Lior Strahilevitz. The second panel, again, my slide's not clear, thank you. The second panel is got an even harder topic, what do we actually do about online choice architecture? So we're very lucky that Angelique Bret from Princep Masons is going to be chairing that panel. She's a competition law expert with 25 years of experience, but in the last 5 years, she's actually been leading the consumer protection practice at Princep Masons and being opposite the CMA on a number of occasions. So on her panel is Lauren Willis, Esra, Ozkan, and Stephen McDonald. So the CMA published these 2 papers on, I think it was the 5th of April. Now, there's the first is a discussion paper, and that's trying to focus on the big picture issues. We've deliberately gone for a wide framing of behavioural issues. I'm sure many of you will have heard about dark patterns or sludge or these kind of things. We're deliberately taking a broader framing, and I think that's really important when we try and think about the impact on competition, that some of those more narrow terms don't fully capture the implications for competition. Now, many of you will be aware of an excellent couple of papers that was co-authored and also put forward by Amelia Fletcher, the Office of Fair Trading, I think it was around 2009, 2010. Really excellent papers. So we're trying to build off of that literature. Unfortunately, she can't be with us today. She's got a board meeting in Edinburgh. But what we're trying to do with these papers is bring the evidence right up to date. We want to include all the latest literature and understanding that comes from actually a very large literature now on dark patterns. And in particular, we're wanting to spell out with these papers what the implications of these design issues are for competition, but also consumer protection. Now, the second paper is pretty long, and there's what we've tried to do there is really go through a large array of literatures and make sure that we've got this very deep evidence base that the CMA can draw on for its future cases, but also other authorities and I'm sure other parties as well globally. So I'll get into can we do the slide? I'm not certain whether that's going with a lag or someone is doing it behind, but what is online choice architecture? Well, really, it's just the overall framing for how we think about decisions being made. And there's 3 different aspects to online choice architecture. The first one is choice structure. So we all experience defaults all the time. I'm sure just within the last few days, you will have experienced opt-in and probably opt-out defaults as well. The example here on this slide is ranking. So we know that ranking in many situations can be a really important force for affecting choice and can have very large effects on choice. But there's also there's also choice information. The example here of choice information is focused on discount information. This is a reference price, but also it could be things like drip pricing and other forms of how information is given. The third thing is choice pressure. So we can absolutely, through things like prompts and reminders, through scarcity norms, through personalization, we can apply pressure to individuals when they're trying to make choices. So what we've done using those three different structures, we've then gone into and said, what do we think are the most important practices that people within the competition and consumer protection world need to know about? So we decided that it was 21. We tried to get it down to 20, but we couldn't quite make it, and structured in this particular way. Now, I think it's really important to say that choice architecture can be wonderfully beneficial. Like, we've all had really good experiences online. When we've got online, we've known what we wanted to get, or perhaps we didn't know fully, and we've been really nice, easy designs, helped us navigate to what we wanted, and you not only get what you want, but you actually have a really good experience as well. So and many of these forces can be used for exactly that as well. But even those same practices that can be positive can also have negative sides as well. And it's important that we understand and can differentiate the difference. But there's also a number of things, normally called dark practices and the like, that are always or almost always used in negative ways. And these are actually mentioned in some detail in the papers, but here on the slide with asterisks. So the online choice architecture can cause three types of harm. So I've mentioned this in brief already. First of all, of course, it can have direct implications on consumers. We can nudge people in ways that might be away from what they actually want, from what's in the consumer's best interest. But also, and very importantly, they can weaken or distort competition. And this doesn't have to be with any form of market power whatsoever. If these practices are used such that individuals, when they're first shopping around for a product, or maybe they've got a product that's ongoing over time, they're considering whether they should move to another firm. If you use these practices to stop consumers or impede consumers shopping around, that's obviously going to have an impact on competition. But last, and by no means least, we have to think about the implication for these practices for market power. And it's absolutely possible to have quite a strong impact on market power. I've already talked about defaults. We can think of many digital examples where defaults can be very important. Now, in particular, I'm sure many of you are aware of the Stigler Center paper that was in July 2019 on the impact on competition on digital platforms. The Stigler Center paper in particular really focuses on the impact of behavioral factors or online choice architecture in particular. And actually the Furman report itself, just a few months earlier, had quite a lot of detail on this as well. So what are we actually going to do about this? So the first thing to say is that we're going to address online choice architecture practices through our ongoing work. And we've been doing that. We've been doing that for a lot of time already. Just to pick a couple of examples, so some of the cases that we've been doing with George and his team, looking at auto-renewals or subscription traps. Also, the mobile ecosystems market study, the behavioural team is working very actively on that. We're also going to do a piece of work that's determining the prevalence of harmful OCA practices, and that's really a bridge between these papers and the practical work that we'll be doing over the next few years. Thirdly, we want to refine our view of online choice architecture practices, talking with other authorities, talking with consumer organisations, talking with businesses and others. And last, we're going to do events like today. We're going to try to raise awareness of these practices, and we're also doing, I'm sure quite a few of you will be aware, there's an online rip-off, tip-off campaign that the CMA has been behind. So, moving over to the next part of today's event. So I'm absolutely delighted to be introducing Cass Sunstein. We often hear, oh, it's very hard to introduce speakers. I don't need to. But for Cass, this is very much the case. I'm sure many of you will be aware, he's literally the second most cited academic lawyer of all time. He's written incredibly influential, many incredible articles, but also incredibly influential books. So I'm sure all of you will have heard of Nudge, that not only had a lot of implications for public policy, but far beyond as well. Or we could take the book last year, Noise, that has also had a lot of impact. And there's literally dozens of other books. Both of these two books were co-authored with Nobel Prize-winning behavioral economists. And in fact, Cass has won the legal equivalent of the Nobel Prize, the Holberg Prize, as well. So I've personally known Cass for about 10 years, and he's also been just incredibly helpful as well. I have no idea how he can be so efficient. And he's really helped be very generous with his time, helping guide us. And in fact, he's been very generous today, and I'm really looking forward to hear him speak. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you, everybody. And I see real people in a real room. That's amazing. It's an honor to get to speak to you on these subjects. And I really want to applaud CMA for its extraordinary work and reports. Now, both an academic and affiliated with our government, I'm speaking in my private capacity. And because I've had a government affiliation, I haven't done much writing of late. And so for you, I've written a little book. It's a little book. It's not going to take a very long time. It has a prologue and 4 chapters, though. So are you prepared for a little book? The prologue comes from CMA and some key words from the terrific report. Those who design the user experience and interaction designers, the content designers and the marketeers, can be thought about as choice architects. And the design of the environment they create is the choice architecture. OCA can distort consumer behavior. Influenced by OCA, consumers may purchase unneeded products, spends more time than they want to, receive poor value items or services, choose inferior sellers or platforms, or search less for alternatives. OCA can weaken or distort competition. That's important. It might sound a little abstract, so let's turn to something not at all abstract. Chapter 1. The title is Terrible. This is an actual lawsuit in which state-of-the-art work on choice architecture appeared before the Supreme Court of the United States and produced, I'm pleased to see that you're sitting down, it produced a unanimous ruling that the use of harmful online choice architecture was a violation of the law. The case involved a lawsuit brought by employees of a distinguished university, Northwestern, who sued the university and officials for violating the duty of prudence with respect to retirement and savings plans. Let's call the employees consumers, shall we? And let's refer to the online choice architecture, which was consistent with the words from the CMA, a recipe for poor choices, including poor value items and services and unneeded or unsuitable products. Those, by the way, aren't my words. Those are the words of the lawsuit. Some of the consumer offerings had really high fees and unreasonably high costs for record keeping. Not all of those fees and costs were visible or understandable if they were visible. Second, the plans included terrible options, thus leading many participants to make bad decisions. Third, there were so many plans that consumers couldn't figure out which ones to choose. There were 400. Many consumers used simple rules of thumb and made terrible, hence the title of this chapter, choices. The university offered a simple response. The employees had freedom of choice. If employees didn't like the options, or if consumers didn't like the options, they didn't have to choose them. The Supreme Court unanimously said that's wrong. Relying on decades of work on choice architecture, including online choice architecture, the court said that it was wrong to rely on freedom of choice. The plans contained a lot of sludge in the form of complex forms, hundreds of pages of supporting information. It contained hidden fees and costly requirements. That was unlawful. Okay, this is a case that is a universe in a grain of sand, and it offers 3 big lessons with which I end chapter 1. First, online choice architecture can have big effects on consumers. It can crush competition and make markets work poorly. I say that with great pain, given I spent decades at the University of Chicago, and even to utter the words markets are working poorly is a painful thing. Nonetheless, it's so. Second, big lesson. However smart we are, even if we're professors at Northwestern University, our intuitions about the effects of choice architecture are not reliable. Behavioral science has uncovered a bunch of surprises, including too many options can be a problem. Even the smartest people show limited attention. Consumers are subject to present bias, focusing on this moment, not the long term. And consumers can be too optimistic and therefore trusting. Last, universe in a grain of sand, firms, even firms that are basically trustworthy, use behavioral science for their own benefit. And that's not wonderful. Chapter 2 is called Almost. You've just heard chapter 1, terrible. This is a success story, chapter 1 notwithstanding its title, for an understanding of choice architecture. The Supreme Court got it, even though they're lawyers not trained in behavioral science. The second story, Almost, is a cautionary note and an exclamation point for those who emphasize the importance of choice architecture and its potential adverse effects on competition. The tale became a number of years ago when a telemarketing firm, cheerfully named Sunstein, persuaded hundreds of thousands of people to pay a monthly fee for subscriptions that were essentially worthless. Telemarketers called people out of the blue and said that there's good news. The consumer could have a subscription to a buyer's club, offering gasoline and airline rebates. This was a terrible offer. It essentially gave people worthless rebates, and they ended up paying a lot of money to Sunstein over the course of their prescriptions. This was not online, but work with me here if you would. Exactly the same thing is happening online right now, this minute, and that's not a risky statement to make because it's happening online every minute. Informed by an understanding of choice architecture and its adverse effects, our Federal Trade Commission sued Sunstein and won. Now, here's where things get interesting. The Federal Trade Commission pointed to the adverse effects of choice architecture. The court thought we need to engage in choice architecture in helping consumers. And here's the choice architecture, which was online in large part, that the court itself designed. If subscribers had been enrolled for 6 months or less in this fraudulent scheme, they would receive a letter saying they're going to be out of the scheme unless they send in a note or push a button saying they want to be in. So the newcomers are automatically out by default and they can come in if they want. The result of that was basically everyone was not involved with Sunstein anymore. No one wanted to get in. If people had been in the plan for 6 months or more, they received, by the court's decree, a letter saying that their subscriptions could continue by default. That's what would happen, but they could cancel if they wished by letter or phone, and let's just stipulate it could happen online as well. The result of that form of choice architecture was to result in about 63% of people continuing to subscribe to this useless plan. If you're with me, 99.8% were free of this useless plan when the choice architecture said, you're automatically out. Do you want to go in? Almost no one went in, but 63% stayed in when the architecture asked them to opt out. The fact that they stayed in was not because they were benefiting from their subscription. It's because the court did not sufficiently appreciate the power of choice architecture. Cancellation should have been the default. The fact that it wasn't cost a lot of money. The reason chapter 2 is called Almost is that the case is almost a happy story. The Federal Trade Commission was right. The court got it half right, but almost is not all. It's a notation about the need to integrate into legal understanding an understanding of choice architecture. Chapter 3, we're zooming along. It's called 5 Dangerous Things Online. That's the title of chapter 3. What is online choice architecture and what is potentially dangerous? Here are 5 things that need attention. The first, thank you, Stefan, for referring to it, is defaults. If people are automatically enrolled in something, that can be good if it's something that most people want and benefit from. But if it's hidden and a way of taking people's money from them without their consent, it's dangerous. And much of what we're observing in dangerous online choice architecture is, let's call them, malevolent uses of automaticity. The second of the fearsome 5 is sludge. Often to opt out of something which is economically harmful to people, including often especially people without a lot of education or money, often administrative burdens, lots of forms to sign, lots of screens to deal with, is used manipulatively by profit maximizing companies to try to take people's money from them. It's a form of theft, this use of sludge, and it's a nice target, I think, for the next 5 years of legal and regulatory activity. The third of the fearsome 5 is shrouded attributes, where there are characteristics of products, sometimes conditions, sometimes prices, sometimes diminishment of value that are not readily visible to consumers, so that in a month or a year or 5 years, they are really surprised at what they ended up purchasing. Shrouded attributes are consistent, alas, with markets. They are often rewarded by markets, but they're inconsistent, hooray, with well-functioning competition. And there's a way of bringing well-functioning competition to bear on the problem by unshrouding the attributes. The fourth of the list of 5 is drip pricing, called out in the report, one of the 2 reports, a technique by which retailers have a headline price at the beginning of the purchase product process, following which other fees, charges, and sometimes taxes are incrementally disclosed or dripped. This is both smart and fiendish, drip pricing. There have been actions taken by regulators in English-speaking nations to counteract drip pricing. They are very preliminary. We ought to be seeing much more. The fifth of the list of the fearsome 5 is complexity. Consumers have limited attention, and choice architecture can often be used to try to manipulate allocation of attention. Competitive information supply from firms competing for attention can reduce consumer knowledge and welfare by causing information overload. And this can be done and is being done deliberately. Call it the evil of obfuscation, in which financially relevant aspects of an interaction are hidden, not because they're shrouded, not that one, but because there's just a lot of words and some of the words are barely intelligible. That can lead to serious forms of market failure. It can be rewarded by competition. It is anti-competitive practice that competition can promote. Okay, so the list is defaults, baleful uses of automaticity, sludge to prevent people from navigating their way through an economic harm, shrouded attributes, hidden characteristics of an interaction, drip pricing, or complex language, all of which are being used online. The last chapter of the book is called Lessons. I promised it would be a tiny book. And the lessons chapter just has 3 items in it. First is, it is imperative that legal authorities ought to recognize the problem of anti-competitive uses of choice architecture that harm consumer welfare. There are general terms in legal systems like unfairness or deception, excuse me, that might be used to accommodate the concern. Different legal systems will have different terminology for the concern. So the first lesson is the urgent need for recognition. The second is that authorities need the capability to build out their own evidence about the effects of choice architecture. We now know a lot, but we need to know a lot more. There's evidence out there, and you're going to hear some, that is terrific. But in 10 years, if we're lucky, we're going to have much more evidence. We'll know what's harming consumers, and we need the capability for regulators to assemble that. Lesson 3 is that courts ought to appreciate those efforts. That is, the compilation of evidence ought to be playing a role in adjudication. And it is, I think, both startling and thrilling that a unanimous Supreme Court of the United States did exactly that just a few months ago in a case which almost no one except yours truly read. But it's a little like a seed that could become a giant and very beautiful tree. I have a last note for you, which is that it's important to support regulatory decisions in court and elsewhere that are made with good but not necessarily conclusive evidence. Certainty is rarely available in this world, and if we have a probability of truth that's pretty high, that ought to be good enough given existing legal standards. There's a world of harm to prevent out there and a world of potential benefit in an era in which so many are concerned with the cost of living, inflation, economic hardship, and uncertainty. The fact that there's a world of potential benefits suggests, I think, an unprecedented opportunity, which is to help everyone, and above all, the most vulnerable in an economically tough time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I didn't know that Cass was going to be writing a little book for us today, and I'm incredibly grateful that he did. I thought that was a real tour de force, and I enjoyed it immensely, and it's very informative. So we're going to hand over now to George Lusty, who's going to take us for the first panel, and this is on why choice architecture makes a difference for businesses and consumers. Over to you, George.
Thanks very much, Stefan, and good afternoon to you all. It's an absolute pleasure to chair this first panel exploring why online choice architecture matters for consumers and markets. I'm George Lusty. I head the CMA's Consumer Protection Investigation team, and a huge number of our investigations over the years, and the ones that we're doing right now, have featured one or more dimensions of online choice architecture. I'm not sure we always thought about it in those terms, but we knew that people's choices were being steered, often in very unhelpful ways, in investigations through online dating, cloud storage, gambling, hotel booking sites, car hire. And of course, we're looking at it right now in investigations like auto-renewing subscriptions and the impact of misleading environmental claims. Now, I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by 3 expert professors in this first panel this afternoon. Professor Lucia Reisch, Professor Lior Strahilevitz, and Professor Eric Johnson. I'll say a little bit more about each of them in turn when we come to their initial presentations. They're all going to talk to us a little bit about the exam question of why online choice architecture matters, and then we're going to go into some Q&A after that, which I'm very much looking forward to. So we're going to go first to Professor Eric Johnson, who's the Norman Ige Professor of Business Marketing at Columbia Business School and Director of the Center of the Design Sciences and author of The Elements of Choice. We're very delighted to have you with us, and would you be happy to lead us off with the first presentation?
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be here, and more importantly, it's a pleasure to see people live at a conference. I wish I was there. Also, it's a pleasure to hear Cass's introductory remarks, which might take, I feel somewhat usually superfluous when I follow Cass, so that's true today too. Quick observation, which actually comes right out of the book Nudge, which is every decision has a choice architecture. For the commercial actors we're talking about today, obviously someone has intentionally, and often based on data, made a set of decisions that can influence our choices. But this is also true, obviously, in real life when we're presenting restaurants to our spouses, outfits to our kids, but all of us are choice architects. The other thing about this is choice architecture must exist. It's not, there is no such thing as a neutral option. Let's take an example. While the most famous of these might be the no action default that has been talked both by Cass and Stefan, there's always a default. Something happens if you don't make an active choice. But there are a lot of other tools that we've thought about. What Stefan talked about as a rank, or what I talk about as a sort, has an influence. There's no such thing as a neutral order. Something has to be first, something has to be last. Another example is options can differ in their salience, and I'll show you an example of that in a second. But some options can be presented in ways that are bright and draw attention, others not. Again, there's no neutral order. There's no neutral default. The critical question isn't going to be whether or not we have one. It's going to be, are consumers disadvantaged by the choice architecture? It's interesting to be on a wonderful conference with people who've done work in what's called dark patterns. There's been a lot of parallel work. There's one potential distinction, which is that something that is actually true if you believe in there being not an option of choice architecture is it's not the existence of a sorting or of a cost, it's what its impact is on choice. So from a regulatory perspective, this is interesting. It says basically you have to perhaps, from a decision-making perspective, look at what the outcomes are. Something, though, that has been missing in both worlds a little bit is a theory of how these options work. How does choice architecture affect people's behavior? And that's something I've been thinking about a lot, and because time's limited, I'll just give you one example. I propose that people are actually relatively present-focused, that the initial effort of making a decision will actually influence what they choose, not because they're calculating any rational way what's going on, but rather, much like someone who's driving, they're too busy making a decision. In a GPS, you set the route and then you forget it. And hopefully you don't do the thing of changing routes while you drive. That's dangerous. Decision makers often do the same thing. They choose a way of making a decision at the beginning and don't change that. So this notion that initial effort decisions have a big impact, I think, is important. Obviously, defaults work lots of ways. Let me just show you one way. Obviously, they're an easy path for making a decision, and that may be one that people will eventually regret. A second element of ease that I think is important is salience. And this is something that's interesting because it's not part of the decision-making literature on defaults. And I'm going to ask to show one slide that is relevant here. It's what your iPhone looks like when it sets an alarm. Can we have that slide, please, if that's possible? Yes, there it is. Now you can see there are two buttons there, and I kiddingly say maybe my iPhone wants me to snooze. The snooze button is in bright yellow. The stop button is sort of fades away, and there are algorithms, by the way, to measure what is salient. And what's interesting here, it's as if the iPhone wants me to hit, particularly when I'm groggy in the morning, to sleep for another 9 minutes. Now, if you think about this for a second, as we were talking about earlier about every day seeing defaults and default-like behavior, every time you see a GDPR cookie warning, this is often used. The button that lets you share information is bright, salient. The buttons that let you not share information are actually gray on gray, often very hard to see. So that's actually, I think, another tool that we need to use in understanding choice architecture. Going to the point about online, it's actually, although these effects can be both good and bad, they're amplified by online behavior. So if you take my nice little iPhone here and try and make a choice there as opposed to on the big monitor, the constraints are much greater. I can't show as many options. I can't show as much information. A good example of this in research we've done is if I show you a set of options and one is below the bottom line of the browser, I would have to scroll down to see it. We can show you that has a huge impact on market share. As in newspapers, they used to say above and below the fold. On the web, that's an even stronger impact. And on phones, that's even stronger. So that's one way in which choice architecture is even more important online. The second way, and the report talks about this quite nicely, is that online environments can be choice engines. They can actually amplify the good and amplify the bad of choice architecture. For example, they can actually customize the defaults that are presented to somebody so that they're actually as good as they could be for that person, or they could actually choose defaults that are more profitable for the choice architect. So this is a good example of how that customization can not only occur en masse, but also at the individual level. I want to close with two observations. The first, it's early days, but what the research reads to my reading is that people don't understand the influence of choice architecture. Consumers are not capable of doing self-patrolling of the space. If I'm arguing that we don't have much of a theory of choice architecture, why should we expect consumers to have a theory of how choice architecture works? And if they don't have it, it's going to be hard for them to identify when they have in fact been influenced. Normally, they're not both parts of an A/B experiment. They're in one condition and not the other. The other point I want to close with is if choice architecture is unavoidable, we might ask who's most affected. Are there certain classes of people who are more influenced by choice architecture, and should that be part of our thinking? There's now a fair amount of work that shows for both good and bad choice architecture that consumers who are vulnerable, at risk, less knowledgeable about the domain actually show biggest effects. So if we can go to the last slide, I'll just show you one picture of this. This sort of geekly slide shows you what happens when we give people a task of finding a credit card. We tell them how much they're going to be borrowing, so there is a right answer to these problems. You'll see, if you look at the right, that's the effect of both good, no, and bad defaults. And on the right hand, the people who are well off show very small effects of choice architecture. On the other hand, if you go to the left, you see huge effects of choice architecture. Those people who are least likely to make a good decision in general are also most likely to be affected by the choice architecture. The red line are basically bad choice architecture. The green line is good choice architecture. I'd argue this is not only a story about people being at risk, but it's also a story about a really powerful and good thing you can do to reduce disparities. Giving people who are not well off good choice architecture is actually important. So in close, let me point out two things. One is choice architecture is not only inevitable, but it's an incredible opportunity to improve consumer decisions as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Eric. I wonder if your iPhone has worked out that after 9 minutes more sleep, you push its buttons more gently, and that's why it's sort of leading you into that particular pattern. Thank you very much for those insights. And I'm thrilled to have here in the room with me, here in London, Professor Lucia Reisch, who is director of the LRIN Institute of Behavioral Economics and Policy at Cambridge. She's also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Consumer Policy and on the editorial board of Behavioral Public Policy and Food Policy. Would you be happy to give us your perspective on why online choice architecture matters for consumers?
Definitely here, yes, wonderful. Yes, so thanks so much for having me. I'm a, as you heard, behavioral economist and consumer researcher with a keen interest in consumer policy. And I read the report, all 250 pages, and I was actually really impressed. So congratulations for this report. And I have a few reflections on the report, which I would like to share with you now. So just to make sure, I mean, while all of us work and consume and live with biases and use heuristics, online is very different from offline. And that relates to all different phases, to the search phase, to the comparison phase, and also to the purchase phase. We know that from consumer research. And so we are less careful, we are quicker, we tend to skim and browse rather than read. In the moment when there's virtual currencies or less tangible money involved, we get even less careful. Our acceptance and interest in impulse purchase is accelerated in many, many more things. So I think this is really important to, I mean, we know it, but it's important to look at the evidence that is out there. And then just like as a caveat, I mean, this is when we talk about mobile phones, about shopping on screens. We have not yet looked into what happens in the metaverse. And in the next step of virtual environment, where I would assume, and we're starting to look into that, those tendencies are even increased. The second, I hope it's coming. All right, there's 6. Oh, here we go. As Cass already said, there is consumer harm inflicted by dark patterns, and it is quite substantial, and it is so important to really nail that down and to put numbers to it. So this is also why I really very much like those when I just read in the Financial Times that it's, I think, the average UK household has unwanted subscriptions of £60 or so. I mean, these are very, very important numbers, so something to use. But let me add that the harm is, of course, not only monetary. This is what economists are interested in, but it's much, much more. There is costs of time and opportunity costs. There are psychological costs. So people can get really frustrated and really anxious. There's regret. There is also some feel of shame for some people because they think, it's my fault, I didn't do it right, or the family is blaming them. So there is a lot of individual harm, but also, of course, harm done to markets and to the economy and to society. That brings me to my next one. Now they came all at once, but that doesn't really matter. Yes, there's also social consequences because underlying vulnerable consumers, and both structurally and temporarily vulnerable consumers, are hit most. Right? And that can have distributive consequences. And that comes in a time that is very, very challenging, particularly challenging for poorer households, for households with less education, with less media skills, with less bandwidth, and so on. And in the end, that's going to also hurt markets because there's also the risk of loss of trust in markets, not just in specific products, but in like shopping environments. And I think that's also a very relevant and important function of organizations like the CMA, is to make that very clear. These are the real risks, but also trying to create substantial, credible trust in those markets, because in the end, we want markets to work and to work in a fair way. My fourth point is that it's almost like a caveat. Influence is not equal to deception. Might sound very, not very surprising, but this is working a lot with nudges and nudging and choice architecture. This is something I hear very often. No, algorithms and nudges, they're neutral. And it really depends on the goal. It depends on the level of transparency. It depends on who is legitimate to use them. What are the goals? Are they mean? Are they in order help? Could they be helpful for consumers? Welfare increasing, and And lately, I do a lot of work on sustainable consumption and climate mitigation. And lately, there has been, just because the issue is so pressing, there has been even more acceptance of using algorithms, real-time personalization, and real-time data to nudge people into more climate-friendly decisions. And this is something new. And there is a tension. I'm not saying this is easy. I'm saying it's a possibility, and it has to be made. I mean, the governance of it must be really, really thought through and ethical. The fifth point is that often consumer protection is the opposite, or but hindered by the information paradox. So people, when you ask them in surveys, everyone wants information. In the end, we don't really use it. As we already heard, more information is definitely not also better. It can be also extremely confusing. Consumer confusion is actually a marketing strategy. And the other issue that consumer protection has to deal with is what some people have called the tyranny of convenience. I think that is cannot be overrated, because convenience is great, but it does come at a price. And not everyone is aware of that price. And those who want to pay it, fair, go for it. But it has to be made more, I think, more. There must be more awareness of the secret costs of convenience. And then my last point is more, it's almost like a wish list, and that I realize that goes into the panel too, so I'm going to be very, very brief. I think we should be much more interested in digital sovereignty as regards data, data use mostly, digital competences, digital fairness, particularly when we talk about predictive models and scores, for instance. Also, I do think that competition consumer policy do need an upgrade to 3.0, just talking about the metaverse. And then we talk a lot about policy and the consumers, but what about the firms themselves? And I see more and more companies taking corporate digital responsibility as part of the ESG, environmental social governance responsibility agenda. Thank you.
Lucia, thank you so much. And our last panelist to present is Professor Lior Strahilevitz, who's the Sidley Austin Professor of Law at the University of Chicago. Lior has presented his research on dark patterns before the Federal Trade Commission and is one of the most cited active scholars of property law in the United States. Welcome, Lior. Would you give us your take on why online choice architecture matters for consumers and markets?
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'd be glad to. I'll be presenting research that was conducted jointly with Jamie Liguori, who's a lawyer and a PhD experimental social psychologist. And we're going to be talking about our recently published research that really runs several experiments to try and gauge how effective dark patterns are. Dark patterns, of course, are online efforts to use choice architecture to manipulate consumers into surrendering personal information or buying a product or service that they would not otherwise be inclined to purchase. So what we've done is we've run a couple of very large-scale experiments on the effectiveness of dark patterns. I'm going to be talking mostly about our second experiment, which is the larger of the two. But we've run these experiments on thousands of American consumers, and we've tried to make sure that we're not just grabbing a convenient sample, but rather are using a demographically balanced sample of American adults that reflects the overall US adult population in terms of race, region of the country, age, gender, and education levels. And so this is an experiment that's done on nearly 3,800 American consumers. And what we've done is we've told people that after soliciting some information for them, we've told them that we've partnered with the nation's largest provider of identity theft protection services, and would be happy to sign them up for a subscription that'll provide 1 month of free identity theft protection monitoring. And after that first month, they'll be charged. And then we randomly varied how much consumers told they were going to be charged for this service between $9 US a month and $39 US per month. So essentially, this is all a ruse. We weren't actually signing anyone up for anything, and we explained that after the experiment was done. But we convinced our research subjects that there was this opportunity out there that they could sign up for through us. Okay, so let me show you what the experimental setup looked like, and then I'll jump into our results. So we were interested in testing dark patterns, manipulative online choice architecture, both with respect to the content of our communication, the pitch, and with respect to the form in which they were allowed to make a decision. So with respect to content, we tried to employ some of the most widely used dark patterns that we encounter in the real world. Things like hidden information, which put information about the service up towards the top of the page, and put information about the cost of the service down towards the bottom of the page in a less prominent font. We did a social proof exercise where we tried to create a bandwagon effect that would tell people, if you sign up for this service, you're not alone. Thousands of other people have also signed up. We tried to create an urgency message or a scarcity message telling them that we had this very special offer for them, but if they didn't act within 60 seconds, that they would no longer be eligible to sign up for the service. And we employed what dark patterns researchers called confirm shaming, which is the use of emotionally laden language that causes people to have to affirm a statement that they don't really believe in order to reject the service. We also tried several form conditions, and these included sort of classic dark patterns like pre-selection or a default, which is you're initially the box for accepting the service is checked, and you can reject it, but you have to uncheck that box and check a different box. Or we made accepting the service the recommended option. We put that in parentheses. Or we subjected them to an obstruction condition, which was going to give them not a choice between accept and decline, which is what the control group saw, but rather a choice between accept and continue or other options. If they clicked on other options, then they might have to click through another screen or two in order to decline the service. And so visually, if you're trying to understand what's happening in the experiment, we're randomly assigning all of our subjects into one of these different boxes on the matrices, where they could see, in this part of the experiment, 0, 1, or 2 dark patterns, 0 if they were control, 1 or 2 otherwise. So let me show you what the data says. If you see a cell highlighted in yellow, that indicates that the acceptance rates are statistically significant in their difference from the control setting. So control is seeing no dark patterns whatsoever. And the math here is pretty straightforward. What we're representing here are the acceptance rates. And so visually, I think you can immediately understand that not all dark patterns work, but some do work, and the ones that do work can be quite potent. So for example, this slide tells us, if we look at the lower left quadrant, that hidden information by itself, just that one dark pattern of making information about the cost of the service less visually prominent, is going to boost the consumer acceptance rate for our service from 13.2% with no dark patterns all the way up to 30.8% all by itself. And if you combine 2 especially potent dark patterns, which would be hidden information plus obstruction, making it harder to say no and easier to say yes, that will boost the acceptance rate from 13.2% all the way up to 34.5%. And there's not much in the way of dark pattern effort that's necessary in order to come close to tripling the acceptance rate among consumers. By the same token, though, you can see that not all dark patterns work. Somewhat surprisingly to us, the scarcity dark pattern, telling people that they had to act fast, that didn't significantly increase our acceptance rate, and may have actually lowered it compared to the control group, though none of those differences are significant. But the general takeaway here is that confirm shaming, social proof, hidden information, making something the recommended option, making something the default, and obstructing all significantly do increase acceptance rates of the rather dubious service that we offered them. So the dark patterns really mattered a lot. We also tested for half our sample one additional dark pattern, which we do also encounter from time to time as we navigate through apps and the internet, which is a double negative. A double negative will simply be more cognitively taxing to consumers as they think about what choice they are to make in order to act in a manner consistent with their preferences. And so the way we framed it was, would you prefer not to decline this free data protection and credit history monitoring? You have to think about that for a while. I continue to have to think about that for a while, even though I wrote the darn question. And it turns out that the double negative all by itself, apart from any dark patterns, doubles the acceptance rate. That acceptance rate increases all the way up to 33.4%. And crucially, as part of the debrief following this experiment, we asked people whether they had signed up for our identity theft protection service or whether they had declined it. And in general, with the other dark patterns, people understood what they had done. With the double negative, fully half of the people who had formally at least accepted our service actually thought they had declined it. And so if we're thinking about demonstrable evidence of consumer welfare losses, well, this shouldn't be hugely surprising, but we do find that these double negatives result in massive confusion, which I think in this instance is a very good proxy for losses to consumer welfare. So dark patterns really mattered. They turned a lot of no's into yeses when we offered them this plan. But what didn't matter? Well, it turns out price didn't matter. So I told you at the outset that we randomly varied whether our subjects were going to be charged $38.99 or $8.99, a huge increase. And it turns out that that huge increase in price did not cause a statistically significant decrease rather in the acceptance rate, didn't increase it either. So the dark patterns seem to really swamp the effects of price. Why is that? It seems that most respondents thought that they would cancel before the trial was up, and that I think is an unduly optimistic assumption on their part, as we see from clickstream data. So just to wrap up in our last couple of slides, I, like Cass, am associated with the University of Chicago. We often look for market solutions to problems before we urge regulation. And as part of this experiment, we collected a number of different measures of consumer sentiment to try to figure out how much of a backlash there would be. Our research that tried out really aggressive and blatant over-the-top dark patterns did generate significant evidence of consumer backlash, but where we implied these sort of subtler dark patterns along the lines of what I just showed you, we were generating a huge spike in acceptance rates without meaningful decreases in consumer engagement. Consumers research subjects said they'd be willing to do further research with us, whether we showed them no dark patterns or mild dark patterns. The effect of dark patterns was especially pronounced on less educated consumers compared to their better educated counterparts. These results were also highly significant. And so if you were to sort of take away a few points from this presentation, I would really emphasize the bullet points that are highlighted in yellow. It's these subtle dark patterns that are really quite effective in generating subscriptions, but don't seem to generate any significant consumer backlash compared to no dark patterns. We do see that dark patterns really swamp the effects of price, and our research suggests that they really prey on the more vulnerable, less educated consumers who are less able to defend themselves against these manipulative techniques. If you're interested in seeing a lot more data and a lot more analysis, the paper that all this data is drawn from is published online in the Journal of Legal Analysis, which is an open source journal if you're interested in reading more. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Lior. We've got about just under a quarter of an hour for some follow-up questions, which I'm going to put to the panel. Thank you all for those fascinating presentations. Lucia, if I can kick off with a question for you, and then I'll bring in Eric and Lior as well. I mean, people have been used to seeing kind of yellow and red stars on products in supermarkets for ages, and I think to a certain extent have sort of absorbed the kind of the hard sales pitch of sort of legitimate marketing. Where do we think we draw the line between those kind of sort of, I suppose, what we call legitimate sales tactics from the ones that they encounter online that are really harmful? What is it that? What are the factors that distinguish the nastier stuff?
Well, it's hard to say that in a very general way. It's going to be always the individual case, and actually courts have been very much involved in deciding that. So the idea is to take the average consumer, whoever that is, and here I would say you have the average consumer offline is not the same as the average consumer online, and then actually ask the people. And try to, I mean, if the average consumer is deceived, is misled, and you know that could be one of those criteria that we could use to draw a line.
I'm conscious that some of the case law has got the concept of mere puffery, which I think has been baked into some aspects of English court judgments as well, and trying to distinguish what goes beyond that can be quite a challenge, I think, for judges.
Right, yeah.
I'd like Eric to ask you a bit about the role in particular. You talked about sort of choice engines. What do you think the impact in particular is of sort of algorithms sort of loaded on top of those and its impact that it can have on consumer decision making?
Well, on first hand, one thing they do is they scale. So it's hard for me to pick a good option or a bad option for each person if I'm doing a physical store. But online, I can actually pick that option based on things like their clickstream data, the past data. So it's just much more powerful. That's the first observation. The second observation is I think these algorithms are an opportunity to actually improve consumer choice in lots of ways. But the fear, of course, is that's not. I think I'm saying something very much that Lucia just said. At the same time, I think the ability of us to do careful studies, and I thought that Lior study and studies we've done are nice examples where you can look at the quantitative effects of choice architecture is important. The hard part is actually adding algorithms to that, but I think it's a really important research program to be done.
And Lior, we didn't quite get into the sort of the weighted sensor sample that you were talking about, but both you and Lucia talked about the impact potentially on different population groups of online choice architecture. What can you tell us about whether there was a specific impact in particular population groups of your research?
Sure. So we do find that in actually both of our large-scale experiments, this was a result we replicated in the second experiment that I showed you, but it showed up in the first as well. We do show rather consistently that less educated consumers are much more vulnerable, and the dark patterns simply much more likely to work on them. And that's particularly true of the subtler dark patterns. The hit you over the head dark patterns don't have the same kind of education differential, but the ones that just employ, hidden information or maybe, obstruction without running 5, 6, 7 dark patterns at consumers also have these effects. In our research, we didn't actually generate a statistically significant difference in racial groups once we had controlled for education. But there's a brand new working paper by Tommy Crucelli-Katz and Mirav Firth-Matzkin that does find such a racial effect. So I think thinking about race, thinking about other demographic differences, beyond education. I think that's really going to be an important topic in additional experimental research going forward. And that's really, I think, a topic that cries out for further investigation by social scientists.
Yeah, and maybe also add the elderly are typically a specifically vulnerable group. So not just the digital immigrants, but really the elderly who have just not that much exposure and experience. A lot of that also kind of being preyed on has to do with experience, often negative experiences. People, once they have paid a lot of money or others experience stressful experiences, they learn. I mean, we learn via feedback, right? So the elderly and also people with generally less media skills, media exposure, people with language issues. So pretty much also that group that we also in the offline world call the vulnerable consumers.
And Lucy, you talked about consumer protection 3.0 and us needing to move to that kind of framework to sort of properly address some of these practices. Within that, how do you think we could better address the impact on vulnerable groups?
Definitely with, first of all, creating a fair, trustworthy online choice environment. I do think we do need regulation, not specific, I mean, that's for everyone, but specifically to protect those groups. And then also with specific education and skill development in these groups. For some, it might not be possible because they're simply not interested. But for them, let's take the elderly, it's also very relevant to keep access open in non-online forms. That is something that is often forgotten, that the whole world goes online and there is a group that is more or less forgotten and might even lose access to important services, information, and participation options.
Eric, I wanted to ask you a question about the longer term, and in particular, do we sort of foresee a future where people have just internalized all this and absorbed it and learnt to just behave as they did in relation to sort of strike through prices in supermarkets? How do you think this plays out in the longer term?
Well, first observation, if people aren't aware of the effects, it's very hard for them to learn. So if you ask people, were you affected by the default? Most people will say no, maybe other people are, but I'm not. Given the decisions that often are very complicated and are rare, so choosing a investment fund, choosing a real estate contract, a mortgage, it's very hard to learn. It's very different than the world of seeing strikeout prices. So I think that's entirely different. One other observation I'll say, I want to reframe the discussion because I was talking also about the vulnerable. There's a huge opportunity. Education is wonderful, but it's very expensive. So if you're trying to get people, for example, to choose better health insurance, there's an opportunity to do that relatively inexpensively, not by teaching them about how to choose health insurance, but providing them with the correct smart default. And that's much less expensive than educating them for what is a very rare and difficult decision for them. So I think there's an opportunity, and we shouldn't just focus on, preventing harm, but also doing good.
Lucia.
Yeah, maybe just to add, there's this nice article called something like The Empire Strikes Back in the Journal of Consumer Policy, which is really about using the power of algorithms and all these new tools to actually empower consumers. And there are little programs, apps, that can be used, for instance, to very quickly, it's like a traffic light system, to browse and check whether a GDPR is of an online vendor. The GDPR is kind of consumer friendly, whether the fine print contains anything that is high of risk. So I think the idea to make use of the same tools, if you want, of the same options of AI and machine learning for the consumer interest is also something that has not been used as I think it could be used and should be used.
Lior, there's a link question for you from our online audience, which relates to the lack of any yellow shading in the scarcity claims. Do you think that's because people have just got used to fake timers and kind of move beyond that, having booked hotel rooms so many times?
I do, and I actually think this is really important, and it relates to what my co-panelists have just been talking about. I do think there's learning. Consumers do learn, but that learning can be a double-edged sword. So at least if our results are correct, then it does seem that consumers have developed a defense mechanism, and what they do is they probably associate these kind of "you must act now" offers with fly-by-night operators who are maybe selling unsavory products. You know, Apple isn't using those kinds of messages to sell iPhones, but maybe sketchier sellers of sketchy products do. So I do think in that instance, it's a happy story, but consumers can also learn in other respects. So for example, I think consumers often are faced with a nagging dark pattern, which will ask them to enable location tracking or to enable these kinds of cookies. And consumers may come to realize that if they say no initially, then the app or the website will ask them again 2 weeks later, the same question. And then 2 weeks later after that. And eventually when people say no, 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 they're just wasting so much time that they relent and they say, okay, fine, yes, I'll make the constant nagging go away. And that's really a kind of learned helplessness, which is really counterproductive and suggests a really profound need for regulation, so that consumers who are savvy and who are paying attention don't just say, well, I give up, they'll get me eventually, I may as well surrender now. And then just the final point on this, which I think really confirms what Eric said, we actually asked consumers when they were subjected to these kinds of dark patterns, were you free to say no? And in those instances where we employed dark patterns, consumers said, oh yeah, no, I had the option to say no, but I didn't. So I had freedom. And yet I went and signed up for this service that I would have never signed up for had it not been for the manipulative dark pattern. So I think consumers don't fully internalize the extent to which their autonomy has been limited through these manipulative kinds of choice architecture.
So I think we've got time for just one last question, which I'll put to you all, which again is from our online audience, which is to ask what advice you'd give to someone who was considering a career in behavioral science and the pointers you would give them. Lucia, can I come to you first?
Well, come study in the new Institute of Behavioral Economics and Policy in Cambridge. No, I mean, I think basically it depends on what you're interested in. I mean, if you're interested in the collective welfare and the common good, then try and develop those algorithms and behavioral little tools for the consumer interest. Because I think in the long run, that will also help markets. And we all, I think, basically all want to have working markets.
Other institutes of behavioral science are available. Eric.
I think there's a real need for empirical validation of lots of what we're saying. And so I think a good background in how to do experiments online, because it's obviously much easier than having people come into a lab, is a great way of going. And there will be an industry, both in academia and in industry, that will be essentially looking at the effectiveness of the things we're talking about today. And you could do that at Columbia too.
and Lior.
Well, I agree. And just to put an exclamation mark behind what Eric just said, I mean, I think there are behavioral scientists working at technology companies who have a huge head start on social scientists like us who are trying to evaluate these kinds of techniques. Now, in Europe, there's sort of a pending Digital Services Act regulation that might open up some of these tech platforms to independent researchers. I think if that happened, it would be hugely informative and hugely exciting from a research perspective. But what I will say is, there's so many people who are psychologists and economists who are savvy, and they're using their skills to help generate dark patterns that are increasing profits at large tech companies and other platforms. you don't have to be one of those social scientists. You can try and work for government, try and work in academia, and try and be a whistleblower, and help consumers fight back against some of the harms that our research is bringing to light.
Thank you so much. And can I ask you all to join me in thanking all the members of this first panel? Thanks so much for joining us today.
To all the panelists. It's my pleasure now to hand over for our last panel. I'll be handing over to Angelique Bret from Pinsent Masons, and I'll be coming in 2 minutes before the hour to thank you all. I will also give a pitch whilst we were just talking about the jobs that are available. So certainly for any data scientists or data engineers, we've got jobs available right now in my team. So handing over to you, Angelique.
Thank you, Stefan. Great. So thank you so much for inviting me here today to talk about online choice architecture. I'm by no means an expert in OCA. I am target audience. I need to be educated, which is quite right. And clearly, we've heard how important that is to raise the profile of these issues and the harms that are out there. We have the very difficult job now of talking about what should we do about it. Which obviously is a challenge, and I think there's going to be some overlap, of course, with the debate at the first panel. But I do have a really excellent panel to introduce to discuss this. First, it's going to be Lauren Willis, and Lauren is an Associate Dean for Research and Professor of Law at the Yola Marymount University in LA. She specializes in consumer law and policy. Her scholarly works concentrate on the intersection of consumer psychology, market structure, and law. She's a leading critic of the use of financial education, disclosures, and nudges, default settings, in consumer policymaking. And before joining academia, Lauren was a litigator in the housing section of the Civil Rights Division of the US Department of Justice. And hopefully Lauren is going to join us very shortly. Meanwhile, I will introduce Stephen. So Stephen McDonald is Head of Economics for Which, the UK's Consumer Association, where he manages the Economic Research Programme and leads on competition policy. Before joining Which, he was a lecturer in economics at Newcastle University, specialising in industrial organisation. I also introduced Esra.
Hello,
Lauren.
Sorry, I couldn't tell whether you could see me or not.
I can't, unfortunately, but everybody else can.
Alrighty. So we've heard about all of these difficulties with problematic online choice architecture, and we were asked in this panel to talk about what to do. So one possibility, and that was touched on earlier as well, is to educate consumers so they might themselves be able to detect what's going on, or perhaps educating judges so that judges in the courtroom could simply identify when something is presenting a problematic choice architecture. Another possibility is to try to directly regulate the OCA itself. And then there's a third possibility, which is instead of focusing on the architecture, focus on the outcomes for consumers, which is, of course, what we really care about. So educating consumers and judges is really quite unlikely to help, and that is for a series of reasons. So first, we can teach people about dark patterns, but these forms of harmful OCA don't always follow a pattern. So you might look at this screen and think, well, it tells you all the information, you know, you're going to get automatically subscribed or automatically renewed as the months go on. But really, consumers just read this top bit and then stop reading. And honestly, I don't even read that for the most part because I have autofill and my computer automatically puts in my card number and whatnot. And so the only way to detect that that's what's going on is to test consumers, which of course firms do. They see where their customers look through, tracking eye patterns and then through asking consumers afterwards. But this is the type of thing where you could teach a judge about it, you could teach a consumer about it, but it's designed to not be perceived. And so it's going to be very difficult to understand that this is happening when it's happening to someone. Another facet of OCA that makes it problematic is that it can exploit a situation, what situation someone is in. So you're playing a video game, you hit the green button to go, you hit the green button to keep going, you hit the green button to keep going, and now you know that hitting the green button means keep going. Well, this time it means you pay for something with your credit card. Now, unless you're in that stream of playing, it's difficult to see that, right? A judge just sees this last screen or maybe sees these others. But when you put them side by side, well, it looks like you ought to have noticed that you were buying moves. But in the moment of playing, you just keep hitting the green button. So it's very difficult after the fact for the judge to see that. And in addition, judges have a hard time putting themselves in the position of an actual consumer when individual vulnerabilities are being targeted. So for example, the way in which you type or the way in which you move your cell phone can reveal intoxication or other forms of psychomotor impairment. And a judge isn't going to know that when the judge looks at the OCA afterwards. So what about trying to regulate the design of the interface itself to dictate what that needs to look like? There's a few different ways we might do that. We might require disclosures as part of what's shown to the consumer, particular processes the consumer has to follow, or the firm has to require the consumer to follow, or what people call nudges for good. So disclosures, as everyone knows, just are too overwhelming. The number of disclosures out there produces an overload that causes people to simply ignore them. And online, firms have particular tools that they can use that's even trickier than offline. So here's a disclosure that when given to subjects who were about to be asked questions about behavior, whether they engaged in certain behaviors that were sometimes illegal, other times just socially looked down upon, embarrassing. And when you showed people the disclosure before asking them the questions, they were much more likely not to disclose, that they had done these things. No disclosure, people surprisingly quite often honestly answer. But the effect of the disclosure is entirely eliminated if you just put this between the disclosure and the questions. And that is something that consumers are going to, even no matter how many times you tell them, they're not going to know that's happening. And requiring the disclosure as part of the regulation isn't going to be enough. So required processes. An example of this would be in California now, it is state law that if you subscribe to something online, you have to be able to cancel online. But the problem is that you can still make it quite difficult for people to cancel online. There had been these stories about people being required to cancel by phone and staying on hold for 3 hours before they could cancel and giving up. Well, you can make it take perhaps not 3 hours, but long enough to get people to give up when you're trying to figure out how to cancel online. I don't know if any of you have tried to cancel, say, Amazon Prime. There have been studies about how difficult it is for consumers to do that, even though it can be done online. Another possibility is requiring certain nudges. So in the US, we tried this with bank account overdraft. We set the default that you couldn't be charged fees for overdrafting at an ATM or on a debit card. And consumers had to take some sort of affirmative action to opt out of that default. But banks were able to outmaneuver the default. Basically, it failed. Consumers, opted out. That the ones who had been heavily using it before opted out. And just prior to the pandemic, and I think the numbers are back up again, Americans were still paying $30 billion in overdraft fees, and it's very concentrated. The other panel was talking about this too, disproportionate effects of some of these things on low and moderate income consumers, vulnerable consumers, minority account holders. And these amounts of overdraft fees people pay are really quite significant given their income. So why was the overdraft default slippery? And normally we think defaults are very sticky. Well, one thing that happened was that banks were able to make it more costly to stay in the overdraft. And I think there was also an example of this. Lior called it learned helplessness. So every time you try to go into your online checking account or savings account, you would have this pop up. I've enlarged it so you can see it a bit. A pop-up screen asking you, did you want to opt out of the default position? And so here it says, you have to select yes or no. Well, say you select no. Well, they flipped it, the yes and no, what means opt in and opt out. But say you figure out which one is the answer you want. You still don't want any overdraft charges. Well, next time you log on, it's just going to happen all over again. And so you learn that the only way to stop the pop-up from blocking you from your account is to agree to pay overdraft fees. Banks also took some of the behavioral biases that normally make defaults sticky and flipped them. So they made it appear as though the default, the new legal default, was something new, and what you'd been endowed with already was the ability to overdraft and be charged fees for it. They also framed the choice to eliminate the procrastination effect that often makes defaults sticky. And sometimes defaults work partly because people think, well, that must be what's recommended, but the banks were sure to make it clear that they were recommending something else entirely. So directly trying to regulate the design of interfaces is unlikely to get us very far. And so what I would suggest is the use of what I call performance-based or outcomes-based regulation. So instead of trying to regulate a particular type of dark pattern, for example, that consumers eventually will catch on to, right? And sometimes there'll be some wear out, as Lior's study showed. Instead, by then, of course, by the time consumers understand it, the firms have moved on to new forms of patterns. And so instead of trying to play catch up with those, to look right at what is happening to the consumer. So the model here is pollutions emissions regulation, right? We don't tell a factory what kind of fuel to use or what kind of scrubbers to put on the smokestack. Instead, we measure what comes out, and then we give firms the responsibility and flexibility to change their processes so as to meet the emission standard. Well, here, the goal would not be about emissions. It would be that consumers are not confused about key aspects of their transactions and that they don't suffer poor consequences or poor outcomes. And so the policy instrument here would be to use caps on what proportion of consumers could be confused or suffer ill consequences. And firms would be required to do third-party neutral expert audits of samples of their customers or records to demonstrate that they were meeting the caps. And the caps might be set, in different ways depending on how harmful the outcome of concern is. Obviously, we can't make sure no one is confused. There will always be someone who is confused, and there will always be unanticipated poor outcomes from transactions. But generally, the consumers to understand what they're doing to make sort of markets work, right? And won't suffer poor outcomes if markets are working correctly. So some examples. There's this issue about switching costs, right? So instead of trying to micromanage, sort of, do you do it online? Do you do it with a letter on the phone? Just require businesses to demonstrate that it takes their customers no longer to cancel the service than to sign up for it. And it's easier to do that kind of thing online because you can very precisely measure what's going on with the customer. Fees, overdraft fees, other charges require that firms demonstrate that customers know that they are going to be paying a fee, because a big problem with overdraft has been, at least in the US, that people didn't realize they were overdrafting, and approximately the amount of the fee when they become obligated to pay it. And sort of proof of concept of that was in a piece of litigation where the Federal Trade Commission had sued an online lender saying that consumers were not properly informed about fees. And the lender actually hired an expert who tested customers in real time as they were signing up for these loans and incurring fees, and just surveyed random samples of them and found that they did know that they would be incurring fees. And so that was actually a successful defense in that case. Limitations on benefits, like an insurance policy that doesn't actually cover the key things people need. Well, you could use a confusion audit to make sure people do know that the policy is limited, or some kind of consequences or outcomes audit to demonstrate that these limitations on benefits were still consistent with the needs and objectives of the customers that they presented when they were purchasing the policy. So benefits of doing it this way is that it really aligns firm and consumer interests, right? It gives firms an incentive to use OCA to eliminate confusion, to improve outcomes, rather than sort of going along around regulation, maneuvering around it. You could decrease switching cost and increase understanding of what's being offered out there by requiring firms to achieve these levels of understanding, which would increase competition. And it's more difficult to outmaneuver when you're actually regulating for the thing you want. We don't want a disclosure. We don't care about the disclosure. What we want is understanding. And it gives firms the flexibility and the responsibility to use online choice architecture for good, as Eric suggested also in the last panel.
Thanks very much, Lauren. I certainly understand this. Sorry, yes, clap. Yes, I've been hearing a lot about this sort of outcomes testing approach to solutions. I think as a lawyer, my question is how do we enforce that? How practically can you force businesses, and how do you test that they're doing that? I can see that if you've got a problem brought to the authorities, and then they can investigate and check. But I think sort of proactively not forcing, but requiring businesses to do that testing, perhaps is challenging, but interesting. Now, Esra may have a different view. So Esra Ozkan, she is from Google. Esra is a product research and strategy leader with expertise in creating human-centered technologies. Esra has a PhD from MIT in science, technology, and society, and is currently a user experience research lead at Google. Prior to Google, she worked as an innovation and strategy consultant, helping technology companies with a new vision, strategy, and design. Welcome, Esra. We can't hear you. Are you? Online. I'll introduce you. We can move on to Stephen if not. Yeah, I think we'll move on to Stephen. Esra, I'm not sure. We can't hear you at the moment. Maybe just test your earpiece. That's okay. No, okay, that's a shame. But maybe we'll come back to you, Esra. Let's move on to Stephen for the moment. Perhaps we can try and sort that out. So, Stephen, I've already introduced you, Head of Economics at Which. I'm very looking forward to seeing what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Angelique. Delighted to be here. The choice architecture is clearly is everybody getting reverb for me here? No? No, okay, just my ear then. Choice architecture is obviously something which as a consumer association we increasingly care about because we can see the potential for improving consumer welfare. Obviously, if these things help consumer search, then that's going to be good. And particularly if they stop consumers getting really bad outcomes in some certain senses, then that should be a big gain for consumer welfare. But we know, because we've been following the academic research, that actually there's a lot of potential for harm here as well. And we tried to look at the prevalence of this. We surveyed consumers. We used 8 of those practices that were in the excellent discussion paper. And most consumers had seen some combination of those practices. 1 in 8 said that they'd spent more because they'd been exposed to those practices, and you're not alone because 45% said that they felt angry about those, which clearly is not conducive to building trust in markets if consumers are being exposed to that. So we care a lot about it. I've got 4 recommendations and 1 observation. And the first recommendation probably goes a little bit counter to what Lauren said, in that we do see a role for improving, for helping businesses and for educating consumers. So it might well be that for a lot of businesses, they're not investing vast amounts of money in optimizing this. So these smaller businesses might potentially just be aping what they see on other sites, and good guidance could help them to do better. I think there's a nice point in the discussion paper about this can be unintentional, and we should help businesses to not get these unintentional outcomes. And we see a role, of course we do, because we're Which, we see a role for educating consumers and helping them to avoid some of these harms. Savvy consumers will spot some of these things and they won't be exposed to them. But the first observation, or the only observation, which really does echo what Lauren said, is actually that's never going to be enough, because a lot of these harms are hidden, particularly if they're personalised. A lot of these harms might be particularly bad for vulnerable consumers, as we've discussed. But also, we've got to help the businesses who want to do the right thing. And if we don't enforce against bad behaviour, then that's not a level playing field for competition. So that's an argument for that as well. So we need regulators clearly to take action about this choice architecture. And so the second recommendation is that we desperately need to upgrade the consumer protection regulations in the UK. It's clear, through the tortuous struggles to address fake reviews over the past few years, that they are not ideally fit for purpose, and we're pleased that the government intends to address that particular one. But we've got 21 practices here, some of which are always harmful. In drip pricing, it's 11 years since Which made its super complaint on credit card surcharging. And still, we're probably not, as it stands, going to get that bespoke practice added to the consumer protection regulations on that, because we don't know enough. It's not a comfortable position, really, is it? So we need to see additions to that, but there's a lot of these practices that we don't actually know enough about. There's an evidence base to be built there, and until we get that evidence, then we shouldn't be regulating. But there's a problem in that we require primary legislation to add to the unfair practices list, and this shouldn't be a once-in-a-decade opportunity. So it seems like the government suggested that, and I know the CMA called for it, that the Secretary of State should have delegated authority to add to the Schedule 1 of the unfair practices, and we would support that, absolutely. I hope that comes forward in legislation. The third observation is that we think the CMA has done really great work with using the markets regime to uncover a lot of evidence about some of these harmful choice architecture practices. So obviously the digital advertising market study, the mobile ecosystems, but the markets regime is such a powerful tool that we're sure that that can be used very much to shed light on a lot of issues here. So John Penrose called for that market study into sludge, and we think that actually there is potential for cross-market investigation or studies probably into some of these practices. Clearly the OFT did that, and that was a precursor to Which's super complaint on the credit card surge charging, and it's a really great way to bring a lot of this evidence out into the public domain. And the final recommendation, though, is about the digital markets unit. We do see a good opportunity for the digital markets unit to be addressing some of these harmful choice architecture practices through pro-competitive interventions, but especially through the codes of conduct. The paper points out that some of these practices are harmful to competition, but by design, all of these platforms that are subject to given SMS designation, any practice that they do which is harmful to consumers is going to be consolidating their market power. And so we actually think that the DMU will be able to address those fairly completely for those big firms. So there's a couple of recommendations in there which really are very specific about the legislation that we want to see. And disappointing that the government's only put forward a draft Digital Markets, Competition and Consumers Bill. Hopefully that'll come forward soon, and that then they will take the next opportunity in the next session to actually follow that through into legislation.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. Esra is ready, apparently. So can you hear us, Esra?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Excellent. And we can hear you.
That's excellent. Well, hello again.
Please do go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you so much, CMA, for inviting me. It has been great to be on listening to the previous panel and be part of this panel and be among the speakers with scholars that I admire and learn from. So I am, as Angelique mentioned, I am a cultural anthropologist, and I have a PhD in an interdisciplinary field. So my focus is on understanding how science and technology and society interact with each other and shape each other. I currently work as a research lead, as a UX research lead at Google, and I'm really passionate about creating meaningful and thoughtful interactions between humans and technology. Sometimes when people outside of tech ask me what it is that I do, the simple explanation is that I help create easy-to-use products that people love, products that can hopefully achieve people their goals and make their lives easier. So what does choice has to do with great design? So often our users will have a range of options to accomplish any given task, and each product offers a different set of functionalities, interfaces, and features. And as UX professionals, we always have to think about how to present these choices to our users within a wide range of products. And choice has always been at the core of how we build products at Google. And what we're trying to do now is to draw on existing learnings from individual products that we have introduced choices, to academic literature, some of which we have already heard from, and establish new testing practices so that we can create an overarching framework to ensure that we can deliver consistent and coherent choices across our products and optimize user welfare. So that's why we created Choice Lab, which is a research unit with two primary goals. One, create a design framework so that we could inform the best design choice solutions for our users, and establish a data-driven and empirical research process to ensure that what we think are the right solutions actually lead to great experiences in practice. And our goal is the same as before. We want to create choice designs that optimize user welfare on our platforms. So we do want to enable users users to make informed and engaged choices, but we also want to make sure that we don't overload or frustrate users who are tasked with multiple choices throughout their day and trying to get a lot of things throughout their days. I mean, cookie example was given previously by the panelists. We all want our privacy to be respected, but who likes clicking accept on cookie pop-ups multiple times a day? It has become more of an annoyance than a tool to ensure that our privacy is protected. So in creating a design framework to help us with choice solutions, we want to thoughtfully figure out how we balance choice friction and impact through appropriate design solutions, where and when we present choices so that they are the most effective and useful for users. And furthermore, what choices do we provide to users so that they're relevant to their context, languages they speak, technical literacy, and cognitive abilities. And so in that sense, we want to take a nuanced and contextual approach. We want to consider balance. I'm not sure whether I'm on that slide right now. Yeah. Okay, so it seems like the slides that you have are different from the ones that I have, but that's okay. So I think we can go ahead. So we want to ask questions around where does the choice appear in user's journey? How complex is it to make the choice? What is the frequency and persistence of choice? How many times are we asking users to make choices, and are we respecting their choices? In terms of impact, we want to see, is the choice actually impacting users' ability to accomplish the task easily? How easy is it for users to change their choices? With that, we want to build on the great foundation of research on user choice and decision-making that's coming from various fields that you represent, including psychology, behavioral economics, law, and more, and establish a data-driven and evidence-based research process. And perhaps a set of new metrics may also be needed. And we have 3 pillars to do that. 1, we want to test the usability and usefulness of choice design in the context of user journeys, not in a vacuum. We want to measure not just the behavioral aspects of choice, such as were users aware of the choices or did they understand the risks and benefit of choices, but also the sentiments these choices create in them: frustration, distraction, annoyance, or a sense of control and agency. Furthermore, we want to make sure that our design solutions can address the needs of different user groups, and we have touched on already populations that are more vulnerable, and it's not about just vulnerability, but it's also about having different tech literacy, cognitive abilities, and even age, and more ways in which our products, our users are come in many different forms and shapes. And finally, I just want to refer to something that you're, as economists and lawyers, are all familiar with, which is return on investment. So in some ways, we want to deliver the highest return on choice by balancing choice friction and impact. So, and sometimes getting a highest return on choice would require that we actually pause the user, we provide them an active choice screen so that they could pay attention to the choices they're about to make, especially if a serious decision is at stake. But sometimes, depending on what choices we are trying to make and depending on the task that the user is trying to accomplish, it would require a subtle nudge, not an active choice screen, but an accessible choice, so that the user doesn't get distracted from the task at hand, especially if they have already expressed their preference to us initially. So these solutions has to be figured out through evidence and research, and that's why we are so looking forward to collaborating with the scholars and academics in different fields and partnering with the CMA so that we can create choice solutions that are best for our users and the ecosystem. Thank you for the opportunity. Look forward to the Q&A.
Great. Thanks very much, Esra, and hopefully we've still got Lauren with us. So the first question is it possible to put together a set of principles for businesses to follow when designing their online choice tools, and how prescriptive should these be? And I think, Esra, you've just been through the sort of approach that you are taking, which is clearly very informative on that. I wonder if Lauren's still there and we can take her views on that. Is it possible, Lauren?
I would say that the answer is test, 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 right? We don't know what the effect is of a particular choice architecture unless we test people to find out. And it's not necessarily intentional, any of this deception. because oftentimes what's just being measured is like number of clicks, profitability, and nobody's looking at what is causing those clicks. And it is something that even designers don't always know what the outcomes are, and are surprised by the outcomes. And so just to be clear, I wasn't implying that anything was intentional, but you've just got to test, not just for number of clicks, but also for understanding and outcomes.
Yes, I mean, it certainly seems that there can be guidance. I mean, we're really talking about those types of OCA where there is a fine line, isn't there, that it could be harmful, but it might not be harmful, and it's really trying to work out whether it is or not, and putting in place a system to do that, I guess, with the more obvious, perhaps, some of the OCA practices listed in the CMA's paper, like false scarcity claims and drip pricing, which we've discussed. Clearly, there might be other easier remedies, enforcement action, and increased transparency, perhaps. We know that fake reviews are now going to be brought into the unfair trading terms regs, which is great, and there's proposals in relation to subscription traps. But what we're really talking about is these very clever tools, and it sounds as though certainly these experts in the room can come up with some guidance and principles to follow. Second question, which we do have time for hopefully, is what's the role of the regulators in all this? So I suppose it's not just about taking enforcement action. That seems to be pretty clear, although as Stephen mentioned, of course, the DMU is proposing to have much ramped up powers to take action in relation to operators with strategic market status, and we know the proposals for the CMA to have ramped up consumer protection powers too, to be able to take decisions on breach. But what, again, coming back to these more subtle forms of OCA, what role can the regulators, such as the CMA, take in trying to find solutions? Esra, do you want to come in?
Sure. I'm going to, I think, combine the first question you asked, Angelique, and Lauren responded with this one. I think we are aligned with CMA and other regulators in terms of the fact that we want users to have open choices. We also agree that more choices aren't better, and defaults aren't inherently good or bad, and users are overwhelmed with the number of choices they have to make throughout the day. But I think we also know that one size doesn't fit all. The right choice really matters, really is meaningful in the context of the task that the users are trying to achieve, the products that are available or the options that are available to choose from. So it's, I think, clear that we can't come up with a prescriptive solution that will apply to different choice solutions in the context of users' journeys. But furthermore, I want to highlight that we don't have a monolithic group of users, so we have to really be attentive to what solutions work for which group of users, and that also, I think, back to Lauren's point, requires testing. And again, we don't know what we don't know. We don't have the best solutions in hand, so we have to come up with these solutions, but perhaps the solutions that we think with the best intentions aren't the best solutions. But that's why we need, I think, an iterative design process that's backed up by research, evidence-based and empirical, so that we really learn from these iterations and really come up with the solutions that's going to work for users and the ecosystem. So I am thrilled that we are all a bunch of data-driven group of regulators and scholars and academics and professionals in the room. So I think we're going to, in partnership, we're going to hopefully find the right solutions.
Yes, I mean, certainly I think we do need the regulators to fully understand these practices, because most of us won't. And therefore, someone needs to be looking out for interests of all our interests, in fact, as consumers. Stephen, I think just lastly, you talked about educating consumers. I mean, the last question I have is, to what extent is that really? To what extent? How far can we go with educating consumers on OCA?
Yeah, we don't know, do we? Actually, can I go back to the
Yes,
previous
sure.
question? I mean, there's a sense of proportionality on the previous one. Yes, there's practices which may or may not lead to harm. On those ones where it depends very much on the circumstance, the amount that we care about it depends on what the outcome could be, and it might be that it doesn't adversely affect everybody, but in situations where when it does adversely affect you very badly, then we need to be tougher, and maybe that's by better enforcement of the letting consumers rectify the situation. So hence you mentioned subscription traps, or maybe actually taking a tougher line on things which, okay, the practice in itself, might not always be bad, but in particular circumstances where it can lead to very bad outcomes, then maybe we should take a tougher line on what's permissible. On the consumer education piece, I mean, it's like all of this. We don't know. These are immature markets, really, aren't they? I mean, who knows how many generations it took ancient Greeks to learn to get around the markets and haggle for good bargains. But it's clear that people can be more savvy and they can do better, and not everybody is exposed. I think the issue is often the situational vulnerability. Though that you might be savvy and you might 90%, 95% of the time be absolutely fine, and then that one time you just make a mistake because of the market or what's going on in your own life. So there are clear limits.
Yeah, I mean, there's clearly a challenge for vulnerable consumers, especially with the average consumer test, and protecting certain categories of the population above others. I think, in my experience, I mean, I would class myself as pretty savvy, but I've certainly been ripped off online. So, education alone is not going to.
I mean, I've been suckered in, I'm afraid, with the Amazon Prime, and you think, no, I've signed up. And tragically, not once but twice has it happened to me.
Yeah.
So yes, there are definite limits.
Yeah, I've had similar. It really needs to be front page of the Daily Mail for anyone to to take note. So we have a couple of minutes left. Are you ready? We'll finish off.
Yes.
So can I just thank everybody, my fantastic panelists.
So hopefully there's 2 slides left. Somewhere in the back room they'll be able to change them over. So I've just got well, first of all, really want to thank all of the speakers today. I've found it really informative. I obviously read around a lot in this area, and I really feel like I learned several things today, and it was a really, really useful event. So I just really want to thank everyone again. I also want to very much thank the team for putting this together. And when the online audience has gone, I'll come back to that for the people in the room. But there's hopefully 2 slides. I don't seem to see them still. Excellent. So we've just got a few announcements to make. So if you'd like to hear more from Cass, and in fact from Lucia as well, I believe it's the inaugural event of the new Ehlerian Institute, isn't it? And that's on the 8th of June at 5 p.m. Everyone's had to sign up online for this event. So we'll do 1 email, not more, and we'll send you, if people want to actually see the video to this event, we'll also send a link to that event as well, as if people would like to sign up. I also wanted to flag, it was mentioned actually I think once or twice, but if people are interested to go into more detail, you should of course read the CMA's reports, but there's also Eric's popular book as well, which he very, very kindly gave us a pre-launch version so that we could have it and look at it before we actually wrote our paper. So moving to the last slide, please. Great. I also wanted to flag as well, and this link will also be in the email, that we have an event ourselves, 15th and 16th of June. It's got a bit of a different focus, but focusing much more on data technology analytics. It's a day and a half event. I hope if you don't join in the room that you'll join the virtual audience. So that just leaves me to thank you very much. Thank you for tuning in online. Thank you for being in the room today. So thank everyone again. Thanks. And I'm hoping they're going to finish that online, but we shall see.